Episode 8 of Life on Earth is called Lords of the Air, and it is about birds. So this episode opens up with white storks, and this is an animal that we refer to throughout the episode. White storks are basically used as the example of a model bird. And it's a pretty good example because they're pretty charismatic, they're big, they're well known enough. Because they build these massive nest structures, they're pretty visible. And we use them to highlight things like nesting, mating, grooming, feathers, beaks, migration. Everything that's highlighted in this episode is constantly referred back to with the storks. And they're pretty great. I like the stork stuff throughout the episode. Very good stuff. And the first major aspect of bird life that we tackle is feathers. Feathers pretty much exclusively exist in birds. No other type of animal has really developed feathers. And Amber takes a look at the earliest feathers, which existed in Archaeopteryx. So Archaeopteryx is a pretty important animal to talk about in this episode because that was the missing link that was found between reptiles and birds. Obviously Archaeopteryx was a dinosaur, and birds are obviously dinosaurs. And that part of the episode was really good. They did a good job of highlighting how Archaeopteryx would have lived and how it was kind of a forerunner. Obviously it wasn't flying the same way that a modern bird did, it probably glided, but the blueprints were there to the modern bird life. And from there we look at Hoatzin. So Hoatzin are really good because they're a very primitive looking bird. They still have claws on their wings, at least while they're young, and they're really interesting. Again, you don't see Hoatzin very often, but they are a very good example to talk about because they look really weird. They're probably one of the more dinosaur looking birds out there, I would say. So that was really good. And they discuss how birds took to the air and the adaptations that allowed them to live like that, particularly the beak. Obviously, no birds have jaws because jaws are quite heavy, and obviously birds need to be really lightweight. So therefore, they've got beaks. And every bird has a beak. Every single bird alive today has a toothless beak. And we highlight the sheer diversity of that. There's a lot of examples of birds looked at. Everything from pelicans, which are obviously adapted to catching fish, things like vultures for tearing into flesh. Like a whole wide variety of birds are covered in there. It's basically a little mini montage, essentially, of just this bird has this beak, this bird has this beak. Beaks are also pretty important for grooming. So most birds have a preen gland, which provides a secretion that they're able to use to groom their feathers. Birds like ducks take that to the extreme, which actually waterproof the feathers. There's a really good bit of footage of ducklings just swimming underwater. It's really cool, actually, watching ducks feeding because you don't see that often. And it is, quite nice to look at. I think ducks are just pretty charismatic, so that was nice. And we look at other ways that birds use to groom their feathers. Dust bathing. There's this really cool thing with jays that actually deliberately seek out ants to attack them because the acid that the ants produce to defend themselves is actually very good at cleaning them, but also provides a sort of euphoric feel to them. Like it just seems to feel really nice for them. That was really weird. I'd never seen that before. That was pretty cool. One of the more interesting parts of the episode for me, I think. And obviously feathers are really important for insulation. Look at king penguins for the extreme of that. Obviously, as we discussed at the end of the last episode, being warm-blooded and having insulating feathers has allowed birds to live in the coldest places in the world, like the poles. The footage of the penguins is really good at highlighting just how insulating feathers can be. There's obviously varieties between the adults and the chicks. The chicks have obviously these massive brown fluffy feathers, but the adults are just as insulated. It does a good job of showing you that there's a variety of feathers even within the same species that do the same job. I thought that was pretty good. And from there we talk about flight. Obviously flight is, the main thing people know about birds. All birds fly. We get some great footage of terns flying, that's really good. Tropic birds as well. And they highlight wings as well. Wings are obviously, pretty varied throughout the bird kingdom. Seabird wings are highlighted in quite a bit of detail because they're quite long. To travel economically over the oceans, it's in a seabird's best interests not to flap their wings too much, so having wider wings helps them to do that. However, it is pretty useless for landing. There's some really funny footage of boobies landing, and it can't quite seem to get it on the first try. It's going to take multiple attempts to land. That's actually quite funny. We also highlight, even over the land, thermals are really handy. Things like vultures are obviously very well adapted to riding on the thermals, just gaining height by gliding up them. That's, a pretty well-known thing. I think it was good that they talked about that. And swifts are briefly discussed as being the fastest birds. Skimmers are also looked at in quite a bit of detail. That was really weird, actually. It's quite cool seeing them just flying over the water and grabbing fish. That was cool. I didn't really expect to see it in this episode. And hummingbirds are obviously probably the apex of hovering. They essentially function like, insects do. The hummingbird sequence is really good. It does a good job of highlighting their lifestyle. And just the way they fly is obviously, such an iconic thing. They couldn't not talk about it in an episode that deals with bird flight. They're probably one of the most important birds to talk about in regards to that. And another really important aspect of bird life is song. So obviously birds have various ways of attracting mates. For a lot of birds, especially small passerine birds, it is song. We highlight various British birds, things like nightingales, blackcaps, garden warblers. We highlight just how song is important for mating. And we see there are more obvious examples like physical displays, Birds of Paradise are probably the most impressive example of that. We see various Birds of Paradise. Ambra is a bit of a Bird of Paradise nut. He loves them. Basically, whenever there was an opportunity to show them on screen, he would do it because he just wanted to go and see them. So the Birds of Paradise stuff is good. It's good that they highlighted it. Again, it's another good example to talk about. Peacocks, they obviously end that sequence with them because they're probably the most well-known example of really impressive displays in birds. And then they talk about eggs. They don't go into too much detail about what an egg is because we already covered that in the last episode about reptiles, but they do a good job of highlighting just the mechanisms that birds use to look after their eggs. Obviously, all birds are monogamous. It's a male and a female pair that get together to build a nest. We look at various nests that are built, and some weirder ones, things like oven birds. They've got those little weird structures in the ground with a little hole in it. Sparrows are highlighted as being particularly messy builders. We actually see them stealing sticks from the stork nest we're following. That's quite funny. And even some birds that nest on the ground. Eiders are highlighted as a good example. Female eiders produce a down, which is one of the most insulating substances on Earth. That is basically what they use to insulate their eggs up in the Arctic. That was really impressive. The last aspect of bird life that we highlight is that of migration. So because birds can fly very long distances and they're not restricted to the warmer parts of the world, they can move around pretty freely. And we highlight how various species do that. The Arctic tern's a pretty good example because it basically just circumnavigates the Earth from Arctic to Antarctic and back again. So it's more or less constantly in the summer. It actually sees more daylight than any animal on Earth. I didn't really know that. That was really cool. Obviously, the storks that we're following in the episode are in Germany, and when they travel south to Africa, they can go east and go over Turkey, or they can go west and go over Gibraltar. And we see when they hit Gibraltar, they've got to gain height. And we see all these birds, loads of birds, things like kestrels, eagles, various birds that are migrating to Africa, basically just hang around in Gibraltar in September and just coast in the thermals to get enough height to basically travel the distance they need to get to. That was really cool. I never thought about that before. That was really interesting. And actually, Gibraltar was a really good place to highlight because there was just so many species there to highlight that migrate. That was really cool. And then the last bit of footage we get is in Africa. We see the storks arrive in Africa, and it's quite weird looking at the storks that we've seen throughout the whole episode in a really urban setting, in amongst, things like wildebeest and zebra. But that's a very good lead-in into one of the most famous birds in Africa, and that is the ostrich. Ostrich is obviously a bit of an outlier in that it looks nothing like any other bird apart from, the other ratites, things like emus and rheas and cassowaries. Amber highlights how its ancestors probably did fly because it's got all the adaptations for flight, things like wings, feathers, a beak. Amber highlights how ostriches appeared on Earth not too long after the extinction of the dinosaurs, like within 10 million years. A lot of birds attempted to fill that niche by becoming the dominant species on land, ostriches included in that. However, another group of animals were actually more successful in doing that, and that was the mammals, and that's obviously what we're going to talk about in the next episode. So that was a really good way of ending things because there's not as much of an easy transition from bird to mammal, I don't think. Obviously, all the other animals we've looked at have kind of evolved into the next one. Obviously, birds didn't evolve into mammals, but that was a really good way of transitioning into that, I think. That was pretty good. Overall, this episode is a good episode. It's quite a lot to pack in. You do feel like sometimes they're just montaging through things a little bit. There's a lot of bird species out there to cram in. Reptiles is obviously not as many groups of them. Birds are obviously a pretty widely varied group of animals, and it's a pretty detailed look at the many aspects of bird life. So yeah, it's pretty good. So yeah, let me know in the comments below what you thought of this video, what you thought of this episode. Let me know, and I'll be doing the next one next week, which is all about the early mammals. The next few episodes are all about mammals. There's definitely a bias in this series towards mammals. And yeah, as ever, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Or don't if you don't want to. It's perfectly fine. And I'll see you next time, and goodbye.